Let's start with loops. Loops allow you to repeat code. You write a certain expression or a block of code once, and then you define some condition or some looping logic which will ensure that this code runs multiple times. We'll see a real example in just a second. Python has two types of loops: for loops and while loops. For loops are used to loop through elements in a list, or to be very precise, with for we can loop through any iterable. Now we'll see other examples for iterable in the complex data types module. List is the only iterable we have right now. Now we can loop through all elements there and do something with each element. As you can see in the code snippet block here, the syntax is kind of comparable to function definitions. Of course, we don't use the def keyword, we're not defining a function here, but we still use a colon and indentation to mark which code belongs to the loop. In this case here, the print element statement would be executed for every element in a given list. So if the list had 3 elements, we'd execute that print statement 3 times. While loops, on the other hand, execute as long as a certain condition is true. Now, in this example here, we're actually creating an infinite loop because true is, well, always true. But in this module, you will also learn how you can define a condition that can actually become false too. We'll use Boolean operators for that. We haven't learned about them yet, so let's not worry about that right now. Now, an important note about these loops. In a for loop, where we go through the elements in a list, it's not recommended to change that list whilst you are looping through it. Because if in your loop or in your for loop body here, if you dare manipulate the list, obviously for the next iteration, so when you execute the code for the second element, the list has changed. And you could either write code that skips elements or accidentally goes into an infinite loop if you start adding elements there, for example. So changing elements there is not recommended. If you still got a loop where you need to manipulate elements, you should create a copy of the list first. Now that is something I'll dive into with you in the list deep dive module though. Now for the while loop, you should try to provide an access condition that can actually become false. If you do create an infinite loop, as in the code snippet here, Control-Z, which quits the Python process, is the only way of skipping out of that loop. And of course, that will not just end that loop, it will end the entire program. Now, that's the theory. Let's see loops in action then.